My name is Clara Morris. I am 28 years old, and yesterday, I buried the only man who ever truly saved me, my Uncle Richard, a successful tech entrepreneur in Chicago who stepped in when my parents abandoned me and my little brother 15 years ago. You would think the day after his funeral would be about grief, about quiet reflection, about holding on to the family I still had. But instead, I found myself in the waiting room of a powerful law firm in New York City, staring at the last two people I ever wanted to see again, my parents. Imagine being left behind as a child, forgotten, erased from your parents' lives as if you didn't exist. Now imagine them suddenly reappearing the moment millions of dollars are at stake, smiling like they belong, pretending like nothing happened. That's where I found myself. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. I promise. What unfolded in that room will leave you questioning what family really means. And if you've ever had someone from your past resurface only when they thought there was something to gain, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if it resonates with you, and subscribe if you want to hear how this shocking family drama unraveled piece by piece. The mahogany door of the law office opened, and there they were, George and Linda, my parents. The ones who left me and Ethan in a stranger's house in Ohio when I was just 13 years old, vanishing without explanation. I hadn't seen them in over a decade. Yet here they stood, draped in cheap knockoff jewelry, their clothes pretending at elegance, their smiles rehearsed and hollow. My father's once strong shoulders had softened, his hair streaked with gray, but the arrogance in his eyes was unchanged. My mother's face was painted with careful makeup, but underneath the polish, I saw the same woman who always valued appearances over her own children. My heart pounded. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers. Another part wanted to disappear, just like I used to as a child when the shouting became unbearable. Ethan, standing beside me, tensed like a coiled spring. He whispered, "Why are they here?" But we both knew the answer. They weren't here for reconciliation. They weren't here because they had regrets. They were here for the money, for the empire Richard had built, the one he had fought to protect us with. Linda reached toward me, as if she thought she could reclaim the title of mother with a simple gesture. "Clara, sweetheart," she said, in a voice that dripped with false affection. "We've missed you so much." Her words cut deeper than silence ever had. Behind her, George cleared his throat, puffing up like he still had authority, like the years of absence had been a minor inconvenience. "We came as soon as we heard about Richard. Blood is thicker than water, after all," he said, his tone laced with expectation. But in that moment, I knew something they didn't. Uncle Richard was always meticulous, always 3 steps ahead. If my parents thought they were going to walk into this office and walk out with his fortune, they were about to be blindsided in ways they couldn't imagine. That morning in New York, I wasn't just facing my parents' sudden return. I was standing at the edge of a truth Richard had orchestrated to be revealed after his death. A truth that would expose everything they had done, not only to me and Ethan, but to countless others. And it all began in that polished conference room. I grew up in Detroit, in a part of the city people avoided after dark, where broken glass littered the sidewalks and police sirens were the soundtrack of our nights. Our building sagged like it carried the weight of every broken promise my parents ever made. The walls were cracked and stained, the smell of mildew never went away, and cockroaches scattered when the lights flicked on. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that barely held together, 4 people crammed inside, with Ethan and me sleeping on a pull-out couch that squeaked every time we turned over. From as far back as I can remember, I was forced to grow up faster than any child should. My father, George, was a construction worker when he felt like it, but most of the time his real job was chasing bets. Every payday, the routine was always the same. He'd cash his check at the corner store, disappear into some dingy back room with men who smelled like smoke and whiskey, and come back hours later, his fate already written on his face. If he'd won, he'd walk through the door with a swagger, his voice loud, his arms wide, declaring that our luck had finally changed. He'd toss a few dollars on the table, buy us ice cream, maybe even order a pizza, promising that next month would be different. But if he lost, and he usually did, he came home drunk, bitter, and ready to unleash his temper on whoever was closest. I can still hear the sound of dishes shattering against the wall, the sting of his words when he snarled, "You're just like your uncle, always looking down on me." He'd say it when I asked why the rent wasn't paid, when I begged him not to spend what little we had. My survival depended on reading his moods, watching the way he walked through the door, the set of his jaw, the weight of his silence. I knew when to stay invisible, when to hide Ethan in the corner with his crayons, and when to risk speaking at all. My mother, Linda, was different, but in many ways, just as dangerous. She worked at the makeup counter of a department store, and every dollar she earned vanished into knockoff purses, flashy jewelry, and dresses she couldn't afford. She chased an image of herself that never existed, a glamorous version of a life she believed she deserved. Sometimes she'd hold up an old photograph of her as a teenager and sigh, "I could have been a model, you know. I could have been somebody, before I got stuck with you two." She said it like we were anchors dragging her down, not children who needed her. She loved mirrors more than she loved us. Ethan was my responsibility. 3 years younger, small for his age, with delicate features, and a chest that struggled to keep up with him. He had asthma, and I lived in constant fear that one of his attacks would take him from me. At night, when his wheezing got bad, I'd sit awake, counting his breaths, rubbing his back, whispering that it was going to be okay even when I wasn't sure it would. His drawings scattered across the floor, sketches of superheroes and animals, were the only light in that dark apartment. He didn't ask for much, just crayons, paper, and a little kindness. When our parents fought, and they always fought, I made sure to stand between him and their words, to absorb the blows so he didn't have to. Food was another battle. There were nights when dinner was nothing more than stale bread with peanut butter, divided carefully so Ethan had the bigger portion. I learned to stretch every jar, every box of pasta, cutting sandwiches into tiny triangles to make them look like more. I kept a mental list of neighbors who might hand me a sandwich if I casually mentioned that our stove was broken, and I knew which after-school clubs always had snacks. Hunger was a constant companion, but I became skilled at pretending I wasn't starving, smiling as I pushed food toward Ethan. School was my sanctuary. I buried myself in books, in equations, in anything that would prove there was a way out. I worked tirelessly for perfect grades, not because anyone at home cared, but because I knew education was my ticket to freedom. Teachers noticed. Mrs. Parker, my fourth-grade teacher, kept extra milk cartons for me and slipped granola bars into my backpack when she thought no one was watching. She told me once, "Clara, you're bright, don't let anyone take that from you." Those words carried me through nights when I cried into my pillow, wishing for a family that loved me. My best friend Lucy lived just 3 blocks away, but her house was a different universe. Her parents worked steady jobs. Their fridge was always full. Their dinner table was warm and welcoming, and I often found myself there at mealtime without even asking. Lucy's mom never questioned why I showed up so often. She just set an extra plate. Their home was a refuge, a place where I could exhale, even if only for a few hours. One memory stands out sharper than the rest: my 8th birthday. At home it was just another day. My parents didn't even remember. I walked to school trying not to care, telling myself birthdays didn't matter. That night, when I returned home, I found a package wrapped in newspaper comics on my pillow. Inside was a cheap plastic bracelet with purple beads and a card made from scraps of construction paper. Ethan had saved his lunch money for weeks to buy it. He wrote, "Happy birthday, Clara. You're the best sister." That night, I cried myself to sleep, not from sadness, but from the fierce, aching love I felt for my little brother. He was the reason I kept going. He was the only reason. But as much as I tried to hold us together, our world was unraveling faster than I could fix it. The eviction notices taped to our door became more frequent. The lights were cut off more than once. Our refrigerator was often empty except for ketchup packets. Ethan's asthma worsened, and we couldn't always afford his inhaler. I found myself lying to teachers, spinning stories about lost wallets or accidents just to borrow money for his medicine. One night, I overheard my parents in the kitchen, whispering in the dark. My mother's voice was sharp, panicked. "We can't keep living like this." "The landlord won't give us another extension," my father replied. "I know a guy who knows a guy. It's just until I get back on my feet." Then came the words that made my stomach turn. My mother asked, "What about Richard?" And my father snapped, "I'd rather die than ask him for help. He just wants to rub his success in my face." I didn't know what they were planning. I didn't understand the weight of those hushed words. But I felt the shift, the sense that something was coming, something that would change everything. And I was right. Because not long after that night, our lives took a turn I could never have predicted. My parents packed our bags, told us we were going on a trip, and led us straight into the moment that would define the rest of my life. I was 10 years old when I first met my Uncle Richard, though I had heard his name whispered before, always in tones thick with resentment. My father, George, never spoke of him kindly. To Dad, Richard was the golden child, the one who had everything handed to him, the one who had left him behind. To me, Richard was a vague shadow, a relative who lived far away and never visited. At least, not until the day his car appeared on our street. I remember it like a movie. Our building was gray and sagging, kids playing with broken toys on the cracked pavement, neighbors smoking on the stoop. And then, a black sedan rolled slowly down the block. It was the kind of car you only saw in magazines, gleaming under the dim Detroit Sunday. People stopped and stared, as if something alien had landed in our neighborhood. The car pulled up in front of our building, and when the door opened, out stepped a man who seemed to belong to another world entirely. Richard was tall, his shoulders straight, his suit perfectly fitted. He looked polished in a way I had never seen up close. His shoes shone like glass, his watch caught the light, and he carried himself with a calm confidence that made heads turn. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance, it was his smile. It wasn't forced or sharp like my father's when he was drunk, and it wasn't painted on like my mother's when she wanted something. It was real. Warm. Directed right at me and Ethan. "Clara? Ethan?" he said, his voice steady but gentle. I nodded, clutching Ethan's hand tighter. Ethan, only 7, peeked out from behind me with wide eyes. "I brought something for you," Richard continued, kneeling so he was at our level. From the back seat he pulled out 2 gifts. For Ethan, a small remote control car. Ethan's jaw dropped. His hands trembled as he held it, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Go on, try it," Richard urged. Ethan glanced at me for permission before carefully placing it on the ground. The little car buzzed to life, zipping across the pavement. Ethan's laughter filled the air, a sound so rare in our house that I almost didn't recognize it. Then Richard turned to me. In his hands was a thin package wrapped neatly in paper. I opened it slowly, my fingers hesitant. Inside was a book, Great Women Inventors. The cover showed a woman in a lab coat, surrounded by machines. My breath caught in my throat. No one had ever given me a gift like that before. Something that said, "I see you. I know you dream." "You remind me of our grandmother," Richard said softly, almost like a secret. "She had that same spark in her eyes, that same hunger to know more. I see it in you." For a moment, I couldn't speak. No one had ever spoken to me that way, like I was more than a child, more than a burden. My parents never noticed my grades, never cared when I brought home awards from school. But here was a man I had never met, and he was telling me he saw me. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, both comforting and terrifying. Then, my father stepped out of the building, and the atmosphere shifted like a storm rolling in. George's face was tight, his jaw clenched. He sized up Richard like he was an enemy trespassing on his territory. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," he said, his tone sharp, dripping with bitterness. Richard stood slowly, taller than my father, but his expression stayed calm. "George," he greeted, his voice even. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Dad muttered. He glanced at the gifts, his eyes narrowing. "What's this?" You think you can just waltz in here with your fancy car and your money and buy their love? It's not about money, Richard replied. It's about family. The tension between them was so thick I could barely breathe. My mother appeared behind my father, her makeup perfectly applied, her eyes flicking between the two men with a mixture of calculation and unease. She forced a laugh. Richard, darling, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you. That much is clear, Richard said, his gaze steady. The conversation that followed was clipped, every word heavy with years of resentment. My father accused Richard of being privileged, of having life handed to him on a silver platter. Richard countered with quiet firmness, pointing out that excuses didn't raise children, that choices mattered. I could see the shame flicker in my father's eyes, quickly smothered by anger. You think you're better than me, George spat. Because you went to college, because you have a business. Not all of us had that kind of luck. Not all of us waste what we're given, Richard answered. His voice wasn't cruel, but it cut through the air like a blade. Ethan clutched the remote control car to his chest, sensing the danger. I held the book tight in my arms, torn between hope and fear. A part of me wanted Richard to stay, to rescue us, to be the father figure we had never had. But another part of me knew my parents wouldn't allow it. After that day, Richard tried. He called on birthdays, sent cards, asked about school. He offered help, better housing, private doctors for Ethan, even to pay for a safer school. Every time, my father refused. We don't need his charity, he'd sneer. He just wants to show off. My mother never disagreed. Sometimes, when the phone rang, Dad would slam it down before I could answer, muttering, "We don't need him meddling in our lives." But I remembered that day. The way Richard looked at me. The way he saw Ethan's joy. It planted a seed of possibility in my heart. Something fragile but alive. Maybe, just maybe, there was a world outside of ours. A world where someone cared. What I didn't know then was how much I would need him. How that one meeting, that fleeting glimpse of a better life, would become the thread I clung to when everything else fell apart. Because not long after, my parents made a decision that would shatter everything. They said we were going on a trip. And that trip would end with me and Ethan standing on the doorstep of a stranger's house, watching our parents walk away for the last time. It was October in Detroit, the air sharp with the bite of early autumn. I had just turned 13 the week before. There was no cake, no candles, no happy birthday from my parents. Just another day of survival in a household that had long since forgotten what joy felt like. But a week later, my father came home with a strange kind of energy in his step, his eyes darting, his words clipped. "Pack your things," he told me. "We're going on a trip." A trip. The words sounded foreign in my ears. We never went anywhere. We barely scraped by, always behind on rent, our refrigerator often empty except for leftover takeout containers and packets of ketchup. Vacations weren't part of our vocabulary. "Where are we going?" I asked cautiously, and he just muttered. "An old friend's place. Just for the weekend." I should have known something wasn't right. My mother moved through the apartment with unusual efficiency, her hands shaking as she folded clothes into a duffel bag. She hugged me tighter than she ever had, her perfume so strong it made me cough. She didn't meet my eyes. My father avoided looking at me at all, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. And when I noticed that they had packed only one small suitcase for themselves, while insisting that Ethan and I bring enough clothes for several days, the unease in my stomach deepened. We boarded a bus headed for Cleveland. The ride was long, the windows streaked with grime, the air filled with the chatter of strangers. Ethan leaned against me, clutching his sketchbook, his asthma medicine tucked carefully in his backpack. My parents sat across the aisle, whispering to each other, their voices too low for me to catch. My father stared out the window. My mother kept reapplying lipstick, as if appearances mattered even now. I wanted to ask them why we were really going, but something in me told me not to. When the bus finally pulled into Cleveland, the city felt quieter, smaller, less chaotic than Detroit. My father led us down a tree-lined street until we stopped in front of a modest house. The woman waiting on the porch was gray-haired, her eyes tired, her smile forced. "Kids, this is Margaret," my father said. "She's an old friend. She's letting us stay for the weekend." Her house was neat but sterile, the furniture covered in plastic, the walls bare of family photos. There was no warmth there, only a polite coldness. That first night, after a silent dinner of spaghetti and canned sauce, my parents told us they needed to run to the store for groceries. "We'll be back soon," my mother said, applying fresh lipstick in the hallway mirror. She kissed my cheek quickly, almost desperately, before hurrying out the door with my father. Ethan and I sat by the window for hours, watching for headlights that never appeared. His small face pressed against the glass, fogging it with each anxious breath. "Where are they?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His breathing grew shallow, and I recognized the signs of his asthma stirring. "They'll be back," I lied, stroking his hair. "By morning you'll see." But my words felt empty even as I spoke them. Morning came. The sun streamed weakly through the curtains, but there was still no sign of our parents. I tried calling their cell phones, but all I got was a robotic voice telling me the numbers were no longer in service. My chest tightened, panic clawing at me. Margaret moved about the kitchen as though nothing was unusual, her silence louder than any answer. By the second day, Ethan developed a fever. His asthma flared without his medication. His small body shook with each cough, his face pale and damp with sweat. Margaret finally called a local doctor, who brought an emergency inhaler and gave him something to bring the fever down. As the doctor examined Ethan in the next room, I cornered Margaret in the kitchen. "Where are my parents?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "When are they coming back?" She hesitated, her shoulders slumping, as if the weight of a secret had been pressing on her for too long. Finally, she pulled open a drawer and handed me an envelope. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in my mother's flowing handwriting. "Clara and Ethan, we can't continue like this. You deserve better than what we can provide. Don't try to find us. This is for the best. You'll have a better life without us dragging you down." I stared at the words until they blurred through my tears. There was no apology, no explanation beyond a twisted attempt to disguise abandonment as sacrifice. I pressed the letter to my chest, my body shaking with sobs. Ethan looked at me from the couch, his eyes wide and pleading. I couldn't bring myself to read it aloud. How could I tell him that our parents had walked away, that they had chosen to erase us? That afternoon, Margaret called the police. 2 officers arrived, their notebooks out, their faces grim. They asked questions I could barely process. Did my parents ever hurt us physically? Did they mention where they might go? Did we have relatives who could take us in? I tried to answer through my tears, but my voice cracked with every word. "We have an uncle," I whispered finally. "Uncle Richard. He lives in Chicago." The next day was the worst of my life. A social worker arrived, clipboard in hand, her tone brisk but not unkind. She told us we were being placed in foster care. Not together. Separate homes. I clutched Ethan's hand so tightly I thought I might break it. "No," I begged. "You can't take him from me. He needs me. He has asthma. He's afraid of the dark. Please, let us stay together." But my pleas meant nothing against the rules of the system. They pulled us apart in the driveway. Ethan screamed, his small body thrashing as he reached for me. I ran after him, but a police officer held me back. I watched through a blur of tears as he was shoved into the back of a social worker's car, his face pressed against the glass, his hand reaching for mine. I pressed my palm against the window until the car turned the corner and disappeared. That night, I lay in a strange bed in a group home in Cleveland, surrounded by girls I didn't know, the sound of their breathing filling the room. I stared at the ceiling, numb, empty, broken. My parents were gone. My brother was gone. And for the first time in my life, I felt utterly, completely alone. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that this abandonment, the deepest wound of my childhood, was about to set into motion a chain of events that would bring Uncle Richard back into my life in a way that would change everything. 2 weeks after my parents left me and Ethan behind, I was still in the group home in Cleveland. The days blurred together, each one heavy with silence and grief. I barely spoke to anyone. I skipped meals, curled up on my bunk, and clutched the only thing I had left of value. Great Women Inventors, the book Uncle Richard had given me years before. I turned its pages again and again, as though the stories inside could remind me that resilience was possible, that survival meant something. But in truth, I felt like I was unraveling. Then one afternoon, a counselor called me into the director's office. I dragged my feet, my mind numb, expecting another round of questions I couldn't answer. Instead, when I opened the door, I froze. Sitting there, looking worn and exhausted, was Richard. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his face unshaven. I had never seen him like that. He looked like a man who had been fighting battles I couldn't see. "Clara," he whispered, standing so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. His voice broke on my name. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." For the first time in weeks, tears spilled down my cheeks. I wanted to speak, to tell him everything, but no words came out. Instead, I stumbled forward and collapsed into his arms. He held me stiffly at first, awkward in his own grief, then tighter, stronger, as though he could will away all the damage that had been done. For the first time since that night my parents disappeared, I felt the tiniest flicker of safety. The meeting that followed was tense. The social worker explained the situation. Ethan was already with a foster family in Ohio who wanted to keep him. The system didn't make it easy to reunite siblings once placements were set. State lines complicated things, paperwork piled up, courts moved slowly, the words felt like blows. But Richard's jaw tightened, and his voice sharpened with determination. "That is unacceptable," he said firmly. "They belong together. They are my family. I will take them both." The social worker tried to warn him about the process, about how it could take months, even years. But Richard wasn't a man who accepted delays easily. "Hire whoever we need," he told his lawyer over the phone later that evening. "We'll fight it in court if we have to. I want them both by Christmas." In the meantime, he rented an apartment just a few blocks away from the group home. He visited me every day, bringing food I barely touched, asking questions I often couldn't answer. But he never gave up. He told me stories from his childhood, about my grandmother who loved fiercely, about the promises he had made to her before she died. He tried to stitch together the pieces of a family that had been torn apart. 3 weeks later, I was released into his temporary custody. I remember standing in the Cleveland bus station, my small bag of belongings at my feet, when Richard reached for my hand. "You're coming home with me," he said. "We'll get Ethan back, I promise. But for now, you're safe." The ride to Chicago was long, but for the first time in years, I didn't dread what waited at the other end. When we pulled up to Richard's house, I was stunned into silence. Mansion was the only word that came to mind. The iron gates, the manicured lawns, the sprawling brick facade, it was a world I had only glimpsed on television. I followed him inside, my eyes wide. "Your room is upstairs," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When I opened the door, I almost gasped. The bedroom was larger than our entire apartment in Detroit. A canopy bed with crisp white sheets stood in the center, and a walk-in closet already filled with clothes in my size stretched along one wall. My feet sank into the plush carpet, my hands trembling as I touched the soft fabric of a sweater hanging neatly on a hanger. "Is this all for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Yes. The decorator picked things out, but if you don't like them, we can change it." That first night, I lay awake in that enormous bed, unable to sleep. The silence was too loud, the sheets were too soft. I missed the sound of Ethan's breathing beside me. The emptiness felt unbearable. Around midnight, I wandered downstairs and found Richard in his office. The desk was covered with papers, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking about custody arrangements, his voice clipped with frustration. For a moment, I stood there, watching him fight for us with the same intensity he must have brought to building his company. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe he might actually succeed. But the transition was far from easy. At school, I was an outsider. My classmates had grown up with privilege. I couldn't imagine family vacations, designer clothes, full refrigerators. When they asked why I lived with my uncle, I didn't know what to say. "Did your parents die?" one girl asked bluntly at lunch. "No," I said flatly, and left it at that. The truth was too raw, too ugly to share. At night, the nightmares came. I'd wake up screaming, convinced Ethan was having an asthma attack and needed me. Richard would rush into my room, panic etched on his face, only to find me trembling and sobbing. Helplessness flickered in his eyes, but he never left until I had calmed down. After the fifth night in a row, he made an appointment with a child psychologist, Dr. Bennett, who specialized in trauma. Dr. Bennett was kind, her voice soft but steady. "What your parents did says everything about them, Clara," she told me. "It says nothing about you. You didn't cause this. You couldn't have stopped it." Her words became an anchor in the chaos, something I repeated to myself in the darkest moments. Richard wasn't perfect. He was awkward at times, speaking to me as though I were a miniature adult rather than a grieving teenager. He wasn't used to children, and I wasn't used to adults who cared. But slowly, through missteps and small victories, he began to learn. He attended parenting classes. He read books about raising traumatized kids. He hired tutors to help me catch up academically. And most importantly, he showed up day after day, even when I tried to push him away. Still, there was always one piece missing: Ethan. Every night, as I lay in that big bed, I imagined him in some stranger's house, wondering why I wasn't there. The thought tore at me, but it also fueled me. Richard had promised we would get him back, and I clung to that promise like a lifeline. Because the fight to reunite us was only just beginning. And neither of us could have predicted how hard, or how long, that fight would be. When I first moved into Richard's house, I thought the hardest part was over. I believed that once I was away from the chaos of my parents, and the gray hopelessness of Detroit, everything would finally feel safe. But safety, I learned, doesn't erase scars. It only gives you enough quiet to hear the echoes of the past. At school, I felt like a ghost among the living. The academy Richard enrolled me in was prestigious, filled with children who had never known hunger, children who carried brand new phones in their designer backpacks, and talked about their ski trips to Aspen as if it were routine. I sat in their classrooms in my carefully pressed uniform, feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. When classmates asked why I lived with my uncle, I never knew how to answer. Some assumed my parents had died. I let them think that, because it was easier than explaining the truth that my parents were alive, and they had chosen not to be my parents anymore. At lunch, I sat at the end of tables, picking at food I wasn't used to having in abundance. Sometimes, the smell of roasted chicken or fresh fruit reminded me of hunger so sharp that it had carved itself into my bones. I'd catch myself saving apples or rolls, shoving them into my bag, as though I might go hungry again tomorrow. Old habits don't die easily, especially when they were formed out of survival. The nights were worse. No amount of satin sheets or expensive pillows could make me sleep peacefully. More often than not, I woke drenched in sweat, my chest heaving, convinced I had heard Ethan wheezing, struggling for breath. I'd bolt upright, half ready to run to him, only to remember he wasn't there. He was still in Ohio, still in someone else's home, still out of my reach. The guilt ate at me. What if he thought I'd abandoned him too? What if he was scared in the dark, calling my name, and I wasn't there to answer? Richard would rush into my room when I screamed. He wasn't used to this: children crying in the night, teenagers trembling with fear they couldn't name. At first, he hovered awkwardly, standing at the edge of my bed, unsure whether to touch me or give me space. But after a while, he began to sit at the foot of the bed, waiting until my breathing slowed. Sometimes he'd tell me stories about how his mother, my grandmother, used to hum lullabies when he was scared. His voice wasn't soothing in the way a parent's might have been, but it carried something else: the steady promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Still, I was unraveling. My grades, once flawless, started slipping. I couldn't focus in class. Teachers whispered about my potential, but I was drowning in memories I couldn't control. Richard noticed, of course. He was observant in ways my parents never were. One evening, after I failed a math quiz I could have aced with my eyes closed, he said gently, "Clara, I think you need someone to talk to. Someone who isn't me." That's how I met Dr. Bennett. She was a child psychologist with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, her office filled with soft chairs and shelves of books. At first, I resisted. I sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, glaring at the floor. But she didn't push, she waited. Session after session, she let me sit in silence until the words began to spill out, ragged and broken. I told her about the night my parents left us, about the letter, about the last image of Ethan's hand pressed against the car window. I told her how sometimes I hated myself for not holding on tighter, as if somehow I could have stopped it all. She listened, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that changed me. "Clara, what your parents did says everything about them and nothing about you. You didn't cause it. You couldn't have prevented it." It took me months to believe her, but every time the guilt clawed at me, I repeated her words in my head until they became a shield. Meanwhile, Richard was learning too. He was a man who had spent his life in boardrooms, not playrooms. He wasn't used to teenagers with nightmares or sudden bursts of anger. But he threw himself into the role the way he did everything with determination. He signed up for parenting classes, read books late into the night, even consulted with Dr. Bennett about how to support me better. At dinner, he tried to draw me into conversations about my day, even when all I wanted to do was retreat into silence. He hired tutors to help me catch up academically, but more than that, he made sure I had what I needed emotionally, even if he didn't always get it right. Slowly, life began to take shape again. Sundays became sacred. Richard insisted on family dinners, no business calls, no excuses. Sometimes it was just the two of us, sitting across the long dining table, trying new recipes that usually ended in laughter more than success. Holidays were quieter, but they became ours. He bought a small tree that first Christmas, decorating it with ornaments he let me pick out, even though he admitted he'd never decorated one before. It was imperfect and lopsided, but it was ours. Still, nothing filled the gap where Ethan should have been. Every time I laughed, every time I sat at the dinner table, I felt the absence of my brother like a missing limb. Richard never promised me the impossible, but he did promise this. "We'll bring him home, Clara. I don't care how long it takes, or what it costs. We'll bring him home." That promise became the anchor I clung to. It gave me something to hold on to when the nightmares came, when school felt unbearable, when grief threatened to drown me. Because even though my life was shifting into something safer, something more stable, it wasn't whole, not yet. And I knew the fight for Ethan was only just beginning. What I didn't realize was how relentless, how exhausting, and how defining that fight would become for Richard, for me, and for the family we were still struggling to rebuild. By the time I turned 16, the chaos of my early life had begun to feel like a distant memory, though the scars were still there beneath the surface. Richard had fought tooth and nail to bring Ethan back, and by the time my brother finally moved into the Chicago house with us, I felt like we were beginning to live in the life we had once only dreamed of. For the first time, we had a rhythm: Sunday dinners, family traditions, stability. But what came next wasn't just healing, it was growth. And with growth came opportunity I had never imagined for myself. Richard had a rule. He never treated us like children who needed to be shielded from the world. He believed knowledge was power, and he wanted us to understand the world he had built. At first, it felt overwhelming. His company, Campbell Tech Solutions, was a name I had only seen in business magazines. To step inside the headquarters with him for the first time was surreal. The glass towers stretched toward the sky, filled with people who greeted Richard with respect that bordered on reverence. "Good morning, Mr. Campbell," they said, but he always answered with a simple "good morning," as though he didn't see himself as different from anyone else. He brought me into boardrooms, let me sit quietly in the back while executives debated strategies, finances, and projections. I didn't understand half of it at first, but I watched. I listened. And slowly, I began to see patterns. Numbers had always made sense to me, and in those endless spreadsheets and charts, I found a strange kind of comfort. One evening, I asked Richard why he insisted on letting me sit in on meetings. He smiled, almost sheepish. Because, Clara, one day you're going to run circles around all of us. Better you start learning now. When I entered Northwestern University, I carried that belief with me like armor. Business classes that intimidated others came alive for me. While other students complained about case studies, I devoured them. Every weekend, I still spent time at Campbell Tech, rotating through departments like Richard had once done when he was building the company from scratch. He insisted I start at the bottom. Mailroom first, he said firmly. No special treatment. If you want to lead one day, you need to know what it feels like to do every job. So I sorted mail. I answered phones in customer service. I sat in accounting cubicles late into the night, learning how money moved, where it stalled, and how it grew. I shadowed marketing teams, trying to understand why some campaigns sparked like wildfire, while others fizzled out. Each role taught me something about people, about patience, about problem solving. It was exhausting, humbling, and exhilarating all at once. By my senior year at Northwestern, I had begun to notice a gap in the company's offerings. Campbell Tech was focused almost exclusively on large corporations, enterprises, with the money to buy the most advanced security systems. But what about the small businesses? The coffee shop on the corner, the family-owned bookstore, the local art gallery. They needed protection too, but at a scale and price they could afford. I began sketching out an idea, running numbers, drafting what would eventually become my first major proposal. I still remember the night I sat across from Richard in his office, my hands trembling as I slid a folder across his desk. "What's this?" he asked. "My idea," I said. "A subscription-based cybersecurity package designed for small businesses. It's scalable, affordable, and taps into a market we've been ignoring." He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. I braced myself for criticism, for dismissal, but instead, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "This is brilliant," he said finally. "Not only is it practical, it's forward-thinking. Clara, you need to present this to the board yourself." My heart raced. The boardroom was filled with men and women who had been with Campbell Tech for years, people who had watched Richard build an empire. Who was I, a 22-year-old fresh out of college, to stand in front of them and tell them how to expand the company? But Richard believed in me, and when I walked into that boardroom, I carried his belief with me. I spoke for 40 minutes, my voice shaking at first but growing steadier with each slide. I laid out the numbers, the market potential, the strategies for implementation. By the end, there was silence. Then the chairman cleared his throat and said, "I think we'd be fools not to do this." The board voted unanimously to approve. 6 months later, the new division launched. Within the first quarter, profits exceeded projections. Small businesses that had never been able to afford high-level cybersecurity were signing on in droves. And one afternoon, Richard handed me a new business card, Vice President of Small Business Solutions. "You earned this," he told me. "This isn't about me being your uncle. This is about you being the smartest person in the room." I had never felt prouder, not just because of the title, but because I knew I had built something of my own, something that mattered. Ethan, meanwhile, was flourishing in his own world. At the Art Institute of Chicago, he found his voice through color and form. Richard converted a sunroom into a full art studio, complete with north-facing windows and professional supplies. Ethan's paintings were bold, emotional, and hauntingly beautiful, reflecting both the pain of our childhood and the hope of our future. His work began winning regional competitions, and eventually, galleries started taking notice. Sometimes, late at night, I would wander into his studio, watching him paint under the soft glow of lamps. He'd glance up at me, smudges of color on his face, and say, "Do you think we would have found this life if Mom and Dad hadn't left us?" I never knew how to answer. Because as much as I hated what our parents had done, I couldn't deny that their abandonment had set the stage for Richard to step in, for us to grow into who we were becoming. It was a truth that both haunted me and set me free. But even as we were finding our places, building our futures, life had another test waiting. Just when it seemed like everything was finally steady, finally safe, a shadow fell across our world. Richard, always so strong, so steady, began to falter. At first it was small things, fatigue, stomach pains, appointments he brushed off. But when the diagnosis came, it shattered the fragile peace we had built. And once again, I found myself standing on the edge of a battle I never asked for, one that would change everything all over again. It started with small things, details so easy to overlook that I almost convinced myself they meant nothing. Richard was always so precise, so disciplined in every aspect of his life. Yet I began to notice him skipping meals, brushing off stomach pains, and looking more tired than usual after long days at the office. At first, he blamed stress, too many meetings, the pressure of expansion. But there were moments like when I caught him gripping the edge of the counter, his face pale and twisted in pain, that told me something was terribly wrong. One evening, I came home late from a meeting at Northwestern and found him in his study, hunched over, his breathing shallow. "Richard?" I asked, my voice sharp with worry. He straightened quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just indigestion," he said, waving me off. But I wasn't convinced. I pressed him until he finally agreed to see a doctor. The diagnosis came like a knife to the chest: pancreatic cancer. Late stage. The oncologist's voice was steady, almost detached, but the words hit me like a freight train. 6 months to a year. Aggressive, limited treatment options. I sat in that sterile white room, the air buzzing in my ears, while Richard absorbed the news with the calmness of a man used to hearing bad reports and making hard decisions. But this wasn't a quarterly loss or a failed project. This was his life. Our life. I remember staring at him, waiting for him to break, to show fear, to rage against the injustice of it. Instead, he reached over, placed his hand gently over mine, and said, "Clara, we're going to make the most of whatever time I have left." From that moment, everything changed. He approached his illness the same way he had built his company. Methodically, with a plan. He scheduled treatments around board meetings, refusing to step back more than necessary. He called his attorney and financial advisors, updating his will, ensuring every detail of his estate was in order. He met with the leadership team, gradually transferring responsibilities to them, but he kept me close to every conversation, every decision. "You need to see how this works," he told me. "One day, you'll be making these choices without me." But the business side was only part of it. At home, he became softer, more reflective. He began sharing stories he had never told before about his childhood, his failures, the mistakes he had made along the way. Late at night, we'd sit on the terrace, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and he'd say things like, "I don't regret much, Clara, but the best decision I ever made was fighting for you and Ethan. You gave my life meaning beyond anything I built in business." It broke me to hear him talk like that, as though his time was already over. But I clung to those words, memorizing every one. Ethan did too. By then, he was living in New York, thriving in the art world, but when he heard the news, he came home immediately. He converted part of his studio in the house into a comfortable space for Richard to rest, setting up canvases nearby so he could paint while Richard watched. Sometimes Richard would sit in a recliner, wrapped in a blanket, watching Ethan's brush move across the canvas. "You put your heart into every stroke," he told him once. "That's what makes it art." The months that followed were a strange mix of heartbreak and grace. I split my time between running the small business division and accompanying Richard to treatments. I learned to read the language of oncology reports the same way I once learned spreadsheets. I sat in waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear, holding his hand as he fought to maintain dignity against the disease that was stripping him of his strength. But Richard refused to be defined by illness. He insisted on being present for milestones: Ethan's first gallery showing, my promotion to executive vice president. He pushed himself beyond what doctors expected, sheer willpower keeping him upright when his body tried to betray him. Each moment became precious, each conversation something to treasure. 2 years passed, longer than the doctors had predicted, but time eventually caught up with him. His body grew frailer, his face thinner, his voice softer. And then one night, he called me into his room. He reached into the nightstand and pulled out an object I had admired for years. A pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. The metal was worn from use, but it gleamed in the lamplight. He pressed it into my hand. "This is yours now," he said. "You and Ethan are the future of the Campbell name. I couldn't be prouder of the people you've become." Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to nod. "We'll carry it, Richard. We'll carry everything you gave us." He passed away on a summer morning, the sky outside his window an impossible shade of blue. Ethan and I were with him, one on each side, holding his hands as he took his final breath. It felt like the world had stopped, like the air had been ripped from my lungs. Yet beneath the crushing grief was gratitude that he had given us not only safety, but a life, a family, and a future. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, a place so grand it felt unreal. Hundreds came: business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, employees who had worked for him for decades. The mayor spoke about his contributions to the city's technology sector. Former rivals showed up to pay their respects. But for me and Ethan, none of that mattered. To us, he was simply the man who had loved us when we had been discarded. Ethan performed a piano piece he had composed just for him, haunting and beautiful, filled with grief and gratitude. I delivered the eulogy, my voice trembling but steady, telling the world who Richard had been to us. "Family," I said, "isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you." Richard was that for us. And just as I finished speaking, as the last echoes of my words faded in the cathedral, I noticed movement at the back of the room. 2 figures slipped in quietly, their faces older but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan followed my gaze, his face draining of color. It was them, George and Linda, 15 years gone. And suddenly, here they were, standing in the shadows of Richard's funeral, waiting for their moment. I felt my stomach twist with a mix of rage and dread. I knew why they had come. Not for me, not for Ethan, not even for Richard. They had come because they smelled money. And I also knew, deep down, that Richard had prepared for this. What I didn't know yet was just how carefully he had set the stage, and how devastating the truth he left behind would be when it came to light. The funeral was barely over when Richard's attorney, Gordon Chen, approached me and Ethan. His voice was low, professional, but his eyes carried something heavier. "Your uncle's will is scheduled to be read this Friday at 10 o'clock sharp." He was very clear about who needed to be there. I knew what he meant before he said it. My parents, the same people who had abandoned us 15 years earlier, had shown their faces at Richard's funeral, and now they would be forced to sit in a room with us again. The thought of it churned my stomach, but Gordon's steady gaze told me this was exactly what Richard had intended. Friday came faster than I expected. Ethan and I dressed in dark clothes out of respect, though my hands shook as I buttoned my blouse. We arrived early at Gordon's law firm in downtown Chicago, a building with marble floors, oak-paneled walls, and an air of quiet wealth that seemed to muffle every sound. Gordon greeted us in the lobby with his usual calm demeanor. "They're not here yet," he said. "Would you like some water? Coffee?" I shook my head. My nerves were too raw for anything. At exactly 10 o'clock, the elevator doors slid open. My parents stepped out as though they belonged there. My father wore a cheap suit, his thinning hair plastered with too much gel, his knockoff Rolex flashing under the lights. My mother had gone to great lengths to maintain her carefully curated image, her hair freshly dyed, her makeup flawless, her dress obviously new but poorly made. They walked toward us with forced smiles, as if we were a family reunited instead of strangers bound by betrayal. "Clara, Ethan," my mother trilled, reaching out as though to embrace me. I stepped back. Ethan's jaw tightened beside me, his hands clenching into fists. "Let's begin," Gordon said firmly, ushering us into the main conference room before anything more could be said. The room itself looked like it belonged in an old-world movie. A long mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, shelves of legal volumes lining the walls. Several others were already seated. Flora, the housekeeper who had worked for Richard for 20 years, Martin Weber, his CFO, and Jessica Leong, his executive assistant. They nodded to us respectfully as we took our seats. My parents slid into chairs across the table, their impatience already showing in the way my father drummed his fingers and my mother smoothed her skirt repeatedly. Gordon placed a thick leather folder on the table and adjusted his glasses. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Edward Campbell, revised and signed 6 months ago, witnessed and notarized in full compliance with state law." My father groaned under his breath. "Can we skip to the part that matters? We all know he was worth millions." Gordon's expression didn't shift. "Mr. Morris, if you interrupt again, you'll be asked to wait outside. We will proceed according to legal protocol." My father fell silent, but his eyes burned with barely contained greed. The reading began with bequests to charities, millions set aside for medical research, scholarships for foster children, and grants for the arts. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line as she realized none of it was for her. Flora wiped tears from her eyes when Gordon announced she was being left the lakeside cottage she had always admired, along with a generous retirement fund. Jessica and Martin received significant financial gifts in gratitude for their loyalty. Finally, Gordon's tone shifted. "And now we come to the matter of George and Linda Morris." My father straightened, nudging my mother. Both of them fixed their faces into expressions of solemn expectation, as though they were about to be honored. "To my brother George Morris and his wife Linda," Gordon read, his voice steady. "I leave the sum of $1 each, along with a letter to be read aloud at this time." The silence that followed was broken by my father's outburst. $1? This is a joke! Some kind of sick prank! His voice echoed off the walls, but Gordon didn't flinch. He opened a sealed envelope and unfolded several pages covered in Richard's familiar handwriting. "If this letter is being read to you," Gordon began, "it means you have done exactly what I predicted, reappeared after 15 years, drawn not by love, but by the scent of money like vultures circling carrion." My mother gasped theatrically, clutching her chest. Gordon continued, his tone unwavering. "What you do not know is that I have documented every attempt you made to extort me after abandoning your children. 15 years ago, only 3 days after leaving Clara and Ethan with a stranger, you contacted me demanding $50,000 to keep quiet about what you called my part in separating them from you. Over the years, you repeated these attempts no fewer than 13 times. I recorded every phone call, preserved every email, and saved every threatening letter." Ethan's eyes widened beside me. I felt my stomach drop. We had never known any of this. My parents' faces drained of color. My father tried to speak, but Gordon pressed a button on a remote. A screen descended from the ceiling. A video flickered to life. There was my father, visibly drunk in a dingy motel room, slurring his words into the camera. "Come on, Richard. 50 grand is nothing to you. Just a little brother helping out family. But if you don't pay this time, maybe Clara needs to hear how her precious uncle really got custody." The video cut to my mother in another setting, her voice smooth, her expression cold. "Richard, be reasonable. We could have fought for custody. We could tell Clara you kidnapped her, that we've been searching all these years. Is that what you want? Just wire the money, like before." The silence in the room was absolute except for Ethan's ragged breathing. My parents squirmed in their chairs, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. Gordon folded the letter carefully. "As of this morning, all evidence has been turned over to the FBI, along with documentation of your other fraudulent activities across state lines." Right on cue, the door opened. 2 men in dark suits entered, flashing their badges. "George and Linda Morris, we need you to come with us. We have questions about multiple fraud investigations." My father lunged toward me, his face twisted with rage. "This is your fault. You turned him against us. We're your parents." The agents restrained him quickly as my mother collapsed into noisy sobs, reaching toward me. "Clara, please, we're your family. Don't let them take your mother away. I sat frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. There should have been satisfaction, vindication, but instead there was only emptiness. They had been exposed, humiliated, dragged into the light of their own corruption, and yet I felt no triumph, only grief for what could never be. As the agents escorted them out, still shouting and pleading, Gordon cleared his throat. His voice softened when he turned back to me and Ethan. Your uncle anticipated this might be overwhelming. He left letters for each of you, to be read in private. But before that, there is one final matter. The remainder of his estate, including his shares in Campbell Tech, all real estate holdings, investments, and personal property, is left equally to his beloved children, Clara and Ethan Campbell. The words hit me like a tidal wave. Not nieces and nephews. Children. He had called us his children, even in his final will. And as Gordon slid 2 envelopes across the table toward us, my hands trembled. Inside was the last message Richard had ever written for me. And I knew whatever it contained would change how I saw everything that had come before, and everything still to come. When I think back on everything Detroit, the night of abandonment, the endless court battles, Richard's quiet determination, and the will that revealed truths I had never known, I realize that my story is not one of tragedy, but of transformation. Pain was the soil I was planted in, but love was what allowed me to grow. Richard taught me that family is not about blood, but about choice. It's about who stays, who fights for you, who shows up even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard. For years, I thought I was defined by what I had lost. Parents who chose to walk away. A childhood that was stolen. But standing in Richard's house, holding his letter, I understood that I was defined instead by what I had gained. A father, in all the ways that mattered. A brother who survived alongside me. A chance to create something better out of the ashes of abandonment. That understanding became my compass. It guided me as I took over the small business division of Campbell Tech, determined not just to protect companies, but to protect the people behind them. The dreamers, the workers, the families. It guided me when I created the Campbell Foundation, a space dedicated to reuniting siblings torn apart by foster care, because I knew firsthand how vital that bond could be. And it guided me in the way I love Ethan, in the way I honor Richard's memory every day, not by mourning endlessly, but by living fully. There are still nights when grief sneaks up on me. When I walk past Richard's study and expect to see him there, glasses perched on his nose, his desk covered in papers, but instead of despair, I feel gratitude. He gave me 15 years of love and stability, years that rewrote the trajectory of my life. He turned abandonment into belonging, despair into hope. That is his true legacy, not the money, not the company, but the love he left behind. And maybe that's what I want you to take away from my story. That sometimes, the deepest wounds can be the very thing that teaches us strength. That chosen family can be stronger than blood. That the people who fight for you, who refuse to give up on you, can heal hurts you thought were permanent. If my story resonates with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear that family is something you can build, not just something you're born into. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found family in someone unexpected? Someone who showed you love when you least expected it? I'd love to hear your story.